Good morning, all, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Yeah, well, so probably good morning, all. We are talking today about 7 guidelines for an equitable website. We're going to do this is a half-hour webinar, so we're doing a little bit of a neutron star of information. Honestly, there are 7 points. I have 7 slides, and each of the slides could be a full webinar in of themselves pretty easily. Um, Great. And let's get underway. Who am I? I am Laura S. Quinn. I am the editor of the nonprofit website Insider, which is a website and a newsletter with lots of articles and tips for those who are managing their own websites at their own organizations. I also do website strategy, and I'm a coach for those who are looking for someone to do, like, for instance, weekly calls to help them out with the work that they are undertaking. So you might say, hey, Laura, you appear to be this middle-aged white woman. And I am, in fact, also heterosexual with no particularly interesting minority statuses. So the answers to kind of who am I to talk about equity is a key part, in fact, of my own commitment to equity. So, as a number of Black leaders have said over the years, here's a quote from Malcolm X. Um, all white allies have a responsibility to really to learn about equity, to listen to people in all sorts of communities, and then to speak up about equity, especially to train their white colleagues. We can't leave about the work of speaking about equity only about those who are in traditional minority groups. We're then putting the weight of teaching on people who may have plenty going on already. That said, I think a number of my colleagues who specialize in equity may be here with us today. So they specialize in equity in kind of writ large and are looking to learn about websites. So certainly anybody who knows anything that they feel like I'm overlooking or they have something to add, please. No one can know all the answers. Please speak up in the chat if you have something to add. That goes for absolutely everybody. Let us dive in. Tip number 1, reflect your community. So we're seeing a bunch of photos here, and I'll talk about that first. Um, so photos and images, it's one of the most obvious ways you're reflecting your community. And so you want to think about what you're saying about them. So what are you saying about people on your site or in your community racially, culturally, across generations? Families, for instance, I think when we talk about families, we sometimes have a picture in our mind about a man and a woman and 2 children. But families are all different kinds of things. They could be it kind of looks like we have a mother and her 2 grown children over in the lower left-hand corner. We've got just 2 older people living together on the right. Certainly we've got a kind of 2 dads situation, man, woman, 4 children. And that is important not only when you think about images, but when you're thinking about writing. So that when you write examples, for instance, or stories about your community, you write about and you look for examples that are not just kind of falling into a stereotype. So actually, speaking of stereotypes, so thinking about images, making sure you're not falling into stereotypical roles. Like, so it's, for instance, to look for images of a Black lawyer who is giving advice to a white client, or a male nurse who is treating a white male patient. So kind of just trying to not fall into kind of a stereotypical way of showing roles. You want to also, in your stories, in your images, you want to avoid tokenism. So avoid showing people as just a suffering person. So no one is just a story of despair. Everybody's got strengths, relationships, human characteristics. Um, so you want to make sure. So we don't as much, but call it this poverty porn, where you're saying, look at these poor people living in suffering. Don't you want to help them? It can unfortunately be effective in terms of fundraising, but it's really ineffective in terms of gathering, so both representing your community and gathering support from your community. All right. So that is images and kind of talking about your community. By the way, I just published a short article on specifically about images and illustrations. I'll send that out when I send out the recording. Probably goes without saying for everybody. You want to prioritize accessibility. And this means a lot of different things. So this is things like alt text, making sure you have alt text on images, you have readable contrast, you have keyboard navigation. Um, so what we're looking at here is an example of why it's important to use standard heading levels. So to go from heading level 2 to heading level 3 and then back to 2 and not skip around. This is what a screen reader will literally read out for a person. Um, for instance, link heading level 3 sponsoring event. This is also why it's important that your link is has something more than read here, your link text. So to be able to, that someone who is using a screen reader to understand what the links are, and in fact, they often jump from link to link, can know what that link goes to. In addition to thinking about kind of more typical accessibility needs, it's also very useful to think about supporting neurodiverse users. Um, Unfortunately, some of the things that you might do for some kinds of neurodiverse users are actually counter to other accessibility needs. So you can't do all the things all the time. But some of the things you can do is just prioritize simplicity on the page. Make sure there's not distracting things, so moving things or blinking things, God forbid. Options like dark mode, so to be able to flip the contrast, even as common I don't know if one would call it a disability, but a common thing like having migraines, being prone to migraines, can mean that people have a hard time looking at in fact, a screen as I am presenting it now, and they much prefer to see this dark with white text on it. By the way, I will take questions at the end. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will make sure to make time for them. This is another thing that I think most people are thinking about a lot. But to make sure that your site works on the actual devices that your visitors are using. So for many, many of us, especially those who are working with low-income users, the vast majority of people are probably on a phone. And so that means more than just kind of minimal support for a phone, that would imply things like you should be using your own phone to access your site pretty regularly. Like if you're just looking something up, it's a good habit to get in to use your site on a phone just to have the same experience that visitors are having. To also think of it on like what does this look like on a computer in a library that might have small monitor, maybe not very fast speed. Certainly true of any more rural user. Not everybody has this fabulous two monitor, thing that I'm currently not rocking quite a fancy setup as this, but I have a two monitor setup, which is very handy, but not everybody has it. So you want to use inclusive language and forms. So this means paying attention to all the language across your site. We're going to talk about these forms in just a second, but language including um, so avoiding jargon, avoiding insider terms. So jargon is, I actually just read a really useful definition of jargon being anything that people didn't typically learn about in high school, is kind of a jargon that can exclude people. You want to think about respecting gender diversity, so with neutral language, so a using they rather than he as your neutral pronoun. Inclusive form options. So this one on the right, what is your gender? Male, female. I prefer not to say. This is, I mean, I'm with you until it's male, female, other or neither or a couple of things. You don't need to have 12 things here. And in fact, having 12 things here will just confuse almost everybody. But having your option be, I prefer not to say, is a pretty uninclusive thing to have. And as you think about forms, make sure that your forms can handle diverse names. So some forms, for instance, can choke on accent marks, um, two-letter names. So you'll run across forms that say, I'm sorry, your name must be longer than two letters, which is a little bonkers given that there's a lot of, Asian names, and we're looking at here, I believe this is an Irish name that have two letters all the time. Um, accent marks, hyphens, multiple parts. So basically, all of these things can seem small, but they can really make a big difference in telling your visitors that they're welcome, that they belong. Language access. I am a huge proponent of language access. So if your site is providing information, then in my mind, it's as important to think about language access as it is about accessibility. I feel like there's few of us these days who would put up a site and say, we don't care about accessibility. But for people who are, for instance, providing information to low income users, there's probably a lot more people who can't read English and only read Spanish than are affected by having an accessible website. And that's not to say you should trade off one for the other, not at all. That's to say that you should be thinking about both. And the cost of translation has come way down in the last couple of years because professional translators and translation firms are able to use AI in smart ways. So that is not that's not to say that you should be using AI to do your own translation as much as you should hire somebody who's got a good setup to do translation because they can make a lot of use of things with then a human readable, well, sorry, a human read through of it at the end. So fairly in a fairly large sense, um, you are including people and providing equity by making your website straightforward to use. So the clearer your writing is, the more usable your navigation, the more it's obvious where to go, where when you need something, the more equitable your site is. So you're not excluding people because they can't figure out how the heck to use your site. So writing in plain language, kind of again, we talked about not jargon, but thinking about the reading level. What is the appropriate reading level? So low income users, so they generally recommend about a seventh or an eighth grade level. Um, Almost no one should be writing at, even if you, I worked on a site that was targeting cardiologists, and we were targeting an 11th grade reading level. Not to imply that any cardiologist has 11th grade level of education, but because cardiologists are busy people, and they don't need to wind through really complicated language either. So almost certainly, you should be writing somewhere at a high school level, regardless of your audience. Last one here is to think about making sure that you are organizing your content by what your visitors need, and not by your internal departments. That's it's kind of a almost a navigational jargon. People can't know how your organization is structured. So if you organize your website along those lines, it can really be a barrier. All right, my last tip here, and then we'll wind up and we'll go into questions. So you want to build with communities, not just for them. So if you are, building for, I think this is from an education site, so for teachers, then logically, let's sit down with some teachers or interview some teachers at the beginning of the project. Let's understand what's actually important to them. What are the key things that they're struggling with or that they want? Um, as you go through the project, show people what it is that you're doing and get their reactions to it. That could be user testing or in a more straightforward way. None of this is to say that you should outsource your design process to a committee of anyone, honestly. It's I feel like there has been a bit of in the past, it's now shifting away. But when you say build with communities, it has in the past meant a little bit of let us all sit in a room and create something together, and get out at the end of the day with a vision of what the site will be. I feel like that is actually quite a difficult thing to facilitate, and to come out with a good result. I think it can be done. But I would encourage people who are a little more strapped for time and resources, to think about building with communities as meaning understanding what they need by talking to them and then showing them things as opposed to doing something that is a really an actual community design effort. What else? Oh, also thinking through centering lived experience. So to hire in people who are hopefully have experience with the communities that you are building for, who are in that community themselves, ideally, and then to center their voice as a voice of somebody who actually does reflect it's never really the voice of your user because by the time you get into by the time you have a lot of knowledge about the site, you've kind of already lost the perspective of somebody who is a visitor to your site. But to think about this idea of lived experiences and the people on your team making sure they have a voice because they have lived experience. So fundamentally, I was a little even nervous about saying that this was, seven, I think I called it seven guidelines for, like, I don't want to imply that this is a checklist, because fundamentally it's something that you always are improving in, that you are moving towards. It's not just kind of like, equity, check mark, done. As in, like it's in any area. So to think about, okay, where can you start? This doesn't require perfection or a big budget, but to work towards equity with intention. So with the idea that you can either reinforce stereotypes or injustices, or your website can help challenge those. So to help make sure that your organization isn't just kind of reflecting the world as it is, or God forbid, the world as it was 20 years ago, but helping to shape it for the better. Fantastic. Um, Great. So if you have questions, would love to answer them. Enter them into the chat is the easiest way. Um, I can also, if you have questions, feel free to email me here at laura@lauras.quinn. I do actually answer all the emails I receive. Um, Also, for those of you who aren't subscribed to my newsletter, so you can take a look at the website. Um, there is a newsletter. You'll get notifications of these free webinars, and tips are also free, and there's lots of free stuff everything is free on the website. Um, so you can see that website or sign up for the newsletter. Fantastic. What questions can I answer? We have a fairly small group, so feel free to raise your hand to unmute if you'd like. Or sorry, to unmute by clicking the unmute button. Do I have favorite examples of websites that do access features well? Um, so when I think of that, I think of access features implying accessibility and neurodiversity. Um, that's an interesting question. I'll look up some examples and send them over in the email. But one place to start would be looking at organizations that have as their user base people who are disabled or who are more neurodiverse. So I'm wondering, like, if I were to look up NAMI, so the National Alliance for Mental Illness is what I believe NAMI.org is. Or I'm thinking there are certainly no doubt coalitions for the disabled, things like that. So those who have to be thinking about it, I bet are doing some really interesting things to help in that vein. And there really aren't a lot of shortcuts in this accessibility realm. Like you can get, for instance, these plug-in, they're called widgets. Something that you can kind of just download and put in on your site that will claim it makes it more accessible. Those don't work very well, and in fact can actively make it harder for somebody who is using like screen reader or other kind of expert tools used by those who can't see very well or can't use their hands very well. It can break the browser in ways that make it actively hard for them to use it. Um, Great question. I'll send some examples over in my email when I send that. Other questions, other thoughts, things I missed, other tips. Well, fantastic. We will declare success. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you found this useful. And I hope to see you in another seminar soon. Fantastic.